At our house, we sleep with the heat turned all the way down to 55 degrees. I will assure you this is Piper's decision and not mine. It forces you to hunker down under layers of flannel and fleece. And in the end, I will admit that this time of year is my favorite for sleeping. That cold air on your face while you snuggle down deep in downy fluff. But while this season makes for good sleeping, to me it feels kind of heavy. Maybe it's all the extra layers of clothing, or maybe it's the way that the cold makes me crave rich foods. Whatever the reason, I dread the onset of winter. I don't like the way my hair freezes if I haven't completely dried it before I go outside. I don't like the way the ground gets slippery and I'm always afraid of falling. But above all, I don't like the dark. Last winter, when I was bemoaning the many months ahead before spring, a member of this congregation let me in on her winter survival tactic. Each day when the sky is still dark, in that time before the sun rises and takes the chill off the cold, she gets out of bed and she pulls on clothes and laces up boots and heads outside. No matter how cold it is, she is out there, her face turned up to the stars, beginning her day in that cold, dark silence. When the ground is covered in ice and snow, she just straps on skis and heads out to the field behind her house. She told me that once she stopped avoiding winter, she found out she kind of liked it and realized it was beautiful. You see, there's something about walking toward rather than away from the darkness that transforms it. Former Episcopal priest and modern-day mystic Barbara Brown Taylor just came out with a new book called Learning to Walk in the Dark. It explores this very human fear of darkness that we have. She starts out by recounting a childhood memory about the moments just after her parents would tuck her in for bed at night. She says, "Once the smell of my parents had faded away along with their footsteps, then all of the loose darkness in my room started to collect in the closet and under the bed, pulling itself together with such magnetic malevolence that I couldn't keep my mind away from it. Without the benefit of maturity or therapy, I had no way of knowing that the darkness was as much inside me as around me, or that I had any ability to affect its hold on me. No one had ever taught me to breathe into it. The idea that it might be friendly seemed absurd. The only strategy I had for dealing with my fear was to turn on all the lights and yell for help." Okay, so I read that and I thought, that is so my coping strategy. My first impulse when I feel something that scares me, that I'm afraid will overwhelm me, be it sadness or loneliness or hurt, is to try to escape, to turn on all the lights, so to speak, or to yell for help. In my case, that looks like retreating into the mind-numbing safety of Facebook or Netflix, or maybe a really, really good piece of chocolate. And while you hear my family laugh as if I didn't get it from them, yeah. And while those are my particular escape hatches, almost everyone has an emergency exit strategy for when something comes their way that they would just rather not feel. And there's nothing wrong with that from time to time. I am certainly not one to criticize the desire to finish off a hard day with a good glass of wine or a really bad movie. The problem arises when we are never willing to face those internal shadows. As an adult, Barbara Brown Taylor wonders how her life might be different now if when she cried out in the dark, Rather than flipping on the lights or assuring her there were no monsters, her parents had instead encouraged curiosity about her fears. What if, when they had come to her room, they had asked her, "What color are the monster's eyes? What do they want from you? Do you think maybe they're friendly?" You see, curiosity is a way of walking toward the darkness and then making room for it to be transformed. But instead, her parents installed nightlights in her bedroom and in the bathroom and all along the entire hallway between them. She learned the best response to darkness is to eradicate it or run screaming until someone can save you. But while small nightlights in a hallway can still the fears of a 5-year-old, they aren't much help when it comes to the darkness we face as adults. Fear of sickness and death, fear of being left alone or left behind, financial anxieties, fears about your kids and how they're going to turn out, fears about global warming or Ebola or biological warfare or water running out. The list goes on and on and on, and some days, or particularly some nights, it threatens to swallow us whole. While I was doing some research on this sermon, I came across the word nyctophobia. It's the technical term for fear of darkness or night. And it's derived from Nyx, who was the Greek goddess of chaos. Her role was to ride through the sky at the end of the day, pulling the dark curtain of night behind her. While she doesn't appear often in Greek mythology, when she does, she's a figure of such exceptional power and exceptional beauty that even Zeus fears her. Now, Nyx had a number of children. They were sleep, strife, death, destiny, dreams, and doom. Kind of an intense bunch, right? But here's where it gets really interesting to me. She also gave birth to 2 other children named Brightness and Day. Somehow the Greek understanding was that that same force that gave birth to all of those dark energies that lurk in the shadows also gave birth to daylight and the brightness that we crave. And Greek mythology isn't alone in that idea that light and dark are linked. In our Judeo-Christian tradition, the creation story in Genesis 1 starts off with God creating the world from the formless void, using the raw building blocks of darkness and chaos. Acknowledging that light is linked to darkness is another means to transform it. So keeping that in mind, I want to turn our attention to the text for today. Ezekiel, like so many of the prophets from the Hebrew Bible, seems to dwell in the darkness, focused on the gloom and doom of his day. His voice came to prominence in the 6th century BCE when the Judeans had been exiled to Babylonia. Given this context, what the Judean people desperately wanted to hear is that they would soon return to their homeland, that they would be vindicated and their displacement would soon come to an end. But that's not anything that Ezekiel says in the first 34 chapters of this book. In fact, the passage for today is the lone comforting passage in the entire book. Ezekiel's understanding of God is rooted in a terrifying vision expressed through graphic images of violence. Up until this passage, he insists that believers are helpless before an indomitable and wrathful God who is utterly intolerant of sin. These visions are the stuff of nightmares. They're the monsters lurking in the closets of Ezekiel's mind. Carolyn Sharp, professor of Hebrew Scripture at Yale Divinity School, writes, "The anguish of witnessing wholesale death and cultural decimation, along with the extraordinary stress of involuntary dislocation, made for a heavy burden on the Judean exiles. Ezekiel himself comes close to breaking under the strain of what is required of him. He suffers from powerful cognitive disruption. Some of his behavior could even be interpreted as post-traumatic stress. It's also important to note that at this time, the prevailing understanding of God was of this being who lived in one particular location, in the Ark of the Covenant, which was stored in the Holy of Holies, this part at the front of the temple. Ezekiel's people would have believed that if the enemy had defeated them and taken over the temple by force, that was what God wanted. So in this context, to be exiled from your land and to be exiled from your temple was also to be exiled from your God. And that's what makes today's passage so fascinating. After the previous dark passages about God's anger towards the Judean people, we find this strangely comforting passage that imagines a radically different kind of God. A God who is not located in the temple far away from the people's suffering, but rather is like a shepherd who in the midst of a dark storm ventures out to retrieve the lost sheep, to comfort them and protect them. It says, "As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so I will look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places they were scattered on the day of cloud and darkness. I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down." There's something about walking toward rather than away from the darkness that transforms it. In the midst of these nightmarish visions of destruction, Ezekiel all of a sudden stumbles on this loving and comforting God who goes out of his way to care for those who are lost. Can you imagine how comforting this would have been to a displaced people who up until this moment have been blaming themselves for the situation they found themselves in? What a wild reversal to imagine that you might be beloved, even in the midst of your deepest suffering. How many of you know that feeling of being in a really hard place and just beating yourself up about it, blaming yourself for that hard place, and how comforting it would be to imagine that even there you are loved? Now, I don't personally ascribe to the idea of an interventionist God who doles out punishment and protection. If God did have the power to end all suffering, I'm not sure I would be able to forgive the amount of senseless suffering that I see around me. Rather, my theology is a little bit closer to that piece of Ezekiel's vision. I imagine God as a presence who is with us even in the hardest of times, like a tiny flame of hope whose light is most visible on the darkest of days. I imagine God as a force who is made known when instead of running away from darkness, we show up to one another, bringing unexpected love, undeserved forgiveness, unearned blessings, and peace in the midst of chaos. I recently heard a story that embodies the transformation that becomes possible when we walk towards the darkness. I was the minister for 2 funerals in the last couple of weeks, one of which was just really, really, really sad. And of course, leading up to it, I spent time with the family, and I dug deep into their stories to find the moments of hope. I tried to find points in the funeral to bring some uplifting message. I tried to create a service that would give them comfort on this hard day. And I'd like to think I was mostly successful, but when I left the graveside service, I was just filled with this intense, heavy sadness. On the way home from the graveside, I was riding with one of the funeral directors who asked me if I worked with Reverend Sandra Fisher. I said, "Yes, indeed, I do serve at the same church," and he told me how impressed he was with her. You see, a couple of years ago, they had called her to do a funeral. There wasn't any family member to meet with, and so she harvested information from the obituary and tried to cobble together some sort of appropriate eulogy. But soon after she arrived to the service, it became clear that nobody was coming to the funeral. Not one person showed up. The funeral directors apologized for taking Sandra's time and told her she could go home. I just want to stop here and say there is almost nothing sadder to me than the idea of someone dying and nobody coming to mourn them. Many people would sprint out of that funeral parlor. They wouldn't look back. They would hop into their cars and pick up a pint of Ben & Jerry's and get into their jammies and watch some terrible 1980s movie until the sadness fell away. I'm not saying that's what I would do, but it might be. But that's not what Sandra did. Instead, she declared that no matter the life circumstances that led this person to die without a single person showing up to mourn him, his life still had value. Every life has value, and everyone deserves to be remembered and to have that final journey blessed. And so she said to them, "If you don't mind, I'll stick around and do the funeral anyway." The funeral director and his colleague were so moved that they sat down in the front row, right there in front of the coffin of this man that no one remembered. And like a God who goes out on the darkest of nights to find the lost and the struggling sheep, the three of them ventured into that sadness to remember the sacredness of a person whom they had never met. Now, I don't know what happens when we die, but I'd like to think that if that person was watching, that what he saw was 3 small candles being ignited in the darkness, guiding him back towards the mystery of love at the center of all things, a mystery that we call God, and that by the light of their candles, he finally made his way home. Despite the dozens of services this funeral director participates in every month, that simple service 2 years before was something he still thought about. It nurtured his hope in human goodness, even in the bleakest of circumstances. And when he shared the story with me, I could feel the way it fed my own internal flame. There's something about walking toward rather than away from the darkness that transforms it. Over the course of her book, Barbara Brown Taylor came to understand that maybe the darkness wasn't actually the problem. Rather, by rushing to turn on the lights, we miss out on the gifts that the darkness has to offer. She writes, "While I'm looking for something large, bright, and unmistakably holy, God has a tendency to slip something small, humble, and apparently negligible in my pocket. How many other treasures have I walked right by because they did not meet my standards? At least one of the day's lessons is about learning to let go of my ideas of God so my eyes are open to the God who is." Which leads me to wonder if maybe this is how we survive the winter, or whatever the physical, spiritual, or emotional darkness we each have to confront this season. Maybe instead of running away and burying our heads under the covers, we make the decision to pull on our boots and venture out into the night sky. Once our eyes adjust, we might find that it's not as dark as we initially thought. Each of us has the potential to illuminate as well. When we engage in acts of kindness, acts of love, acts of witness, we ignite tiny flames of hope around us, until gathered together, side by side, we sparkle in the darkness like so many stars on a cold winter night. And then together, as a community of hope, we await the arising of a new day's sun.